patience. Your Excellence, Ambassadors, Honorable Dr. Oslund, ladies and gentlemen, I have great pleasure and honor to welcome Dr. Oslund here at the University of Latvia, small hall of University of Latvia, with his lecture about our neighboring country, Russia, about economical and political and other developments in Russia. Dr. Oslund has a vast experience in this field. For example, he worked as an economic advisor to the governments of Russia, Ukraine, and Kyrgyzstan. He was a professor at the Stockholm School of Economics and the founding director of the Stockholm Institute of East European Economics. Also, he worked as a Swedish diplomat in Kuwait, Poland, Geneva, and Moscow. Currently, Dr. Anders Oslund is a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute of International Economics in Washington. And he is delivering lectures at the Georgetown University. He has worked at the Carnegie Foundation for International Peace as a senior associate and as a director of the Russian and Euro-Asian program. He also worked at the Brookings Institution in Washington and the Kennan Institute for Advanced Russian Studies, and etc. And we know Dr. Oslund as a good friend to Latvia. We all know this book issued, published last year, the book of Dr. Oslund and our Prime Minister Valdis Dombrovskis. The title of the book is How Latvia Came Through the Financial Crisis. And we know positive attitude and analysis of Dr. Oslund about economical developments in Latvia too. Today's lecture is organized by Jean Monnet Excellence Center of University of Latvia and by European Commission representation in Latvia. And I would like to thank colleagues, organizers and partners, organizers of this event. And now we will have this lecture, and after that will be possible to state some questions and comments and discuss. Okay, and now please, floor is yours, Dr. Oslund.
Thank you very much, Professor Kanger. It's a pleasure to be here at the University of Latvia, and also thank you very much to the European Commission for organizing this trip. I should add that our book, How Latvia Came Through the Financial Crisis, is now published in Latvian also. So there is a Latvian version as well. I should say that I was here in Riga the first time in 1974, and I've been here very many times since, so it's always a pleasure to see how Latvia has developed and how it has come back. When I was here in 1974, I was invited to a Latvian family, and one young man in the family, 18 years old, asked me, "No, как вам нравится Latvia?" So I said, well, it's very nice to be here, and I like the nature and so forth. You know, you say these neutral things. And he just cut me short and said, "Мы живем в оккупированной стране." We live in an occupied country. So I was very happy to see that, and very surprised that he dared to speak so firmly. One of my major preoccupations throughout the years has been Russia, and I should say Ambassador Mats Staffansson here, who's my old friend. We have dealt with these issues together for 40 years or so, since we studied Russian together. And today, of course, we have a very interesting situation in Russia with President Putin coming back. And you might have seen the inauguration. I've never seen anybody who looks so unhappy to be inaugurated president. Very, very unhappy. And this means something. And I would like to discuss Russia more from a structural point of view. Where are we really with Russia today? And I might surprise you a bit, because I think that we are seeing something that is more a modernization of Russia, a structural change in Russia. And I think that this is happening not because Putin is coming back, but in spite of Putin coming back. So Putin coming back is the bad news. The good news is everything else, or a lot of other things that has happened in Russia. And I like one perspective on Russia. It's Dmitry Muratov, the editor of the oppositional Novaya Gazeta, who put it like this last year. Russia has two parties. One is the television party, and it has support of 2/3, and that is led by Vladimir Putin. The other party is the internet party, and Dmitry Medvedev is a member of the internet party, but the internet party has no leader. So the question for Russia's future is really who will be the leader of the internet party. And this is where I see the future of Russia lying. And also what Muratov said long before the elections last year, that was that these elections will be won by the television party, that it will be the last elections then that the internet party wins. So my fundamental thesis that I'll put out to you from the beginning, it is that Russia is too wealthy, too open, and too well educated to be so authoritarian and corrupt as it is today. This is a massive contradiction. And I have two numbers that I love giving to my Russian friends. The first is that there's only one country in the world that is as rich as richer than Russia in terms of GDP per capita and more corrupt. That country is Equatorial Guinea. This is not the category you want to be in. And there are only 8 countries in the world that are also authoritarian and richer than Russia. These are 7 small oil countries, and it is Singapore. So Russia is a total outlier in these regards. And normally outliers don't stay outliers for that long, but they change. So let me give you here a few of So, a few pictures of what the Russian economy looks like today. The macroeconomic situation, ever after the 98 crisis, has really been as solid as it could be. For the last 2 years, the growth has been 4.3%. Of course, after a decline of 8% in 2009, that doesn't look outstanding. But if you look to the west and south of us into the euro crisis, this looks pretty good. Russia has had a steady budget surplus, and it's there now again. The current account surplus is huge and steady. The international reserves are now 500 billion, the third largest in the world after China and Japan. Inflation has fallen to an annualized 4% now, which is the big positive change. And unemployment is 6%. So essentially, you can look up on the macroeconomic data and forget about them and say, we don't need to bother about this in Russia. Russia looks good. And if I take it slightly more in detail, here you see how, if you take the left hand axis, you see that Russia's GDP has increased from $200 billion in '99 to now almost $2 trillion US dollars. That is an increase of almost 10 times in the course of slightly more than a decade. And what do you get in this situation? You get hubris and you get Putin. You get a situation where people think that we can walk on water, and then you make mistakes. So whenever the growth is now slowing down to become more normal, then this will not be accepted. The budget is back to balance. If only the Eurozone looked like this, we would not have any concerns. And Russia had massive surpluses from 2000 to 2008. The current account surplus, also massive, and it's now close to 6% of GDP. No concerns about that matter. And the foreign exchange reserves, Russia doesn't try to get more than this. And the inflation that has been the big concern has now become more reasonable. And the big thing that has happened after the global financial crisis, it is that Russia has moved to inflation target and a floating exchange rate. Big countries like Russia that are dominated by commodities should have a floating exchange rate, because the exchange rate should go up and down with the oil price, since oil is so important for the Russian economy. It's totally different for a small country like Latvia. A small open economy that is diversified can as well or should have a fixed exchange rate, in particular when you have this degree of utilization of the foreign currency. So these are totally different cases. I say this since I argue very strongly for Latvia maintaining a fixed exchange rate, and I'm also arguing for Russia having a floating exchange rate. The big issue in Russia is, of course, that the country is highly dependent on energy. And you have here the three important numbers. 2/3 of Russia's exports are oil and gas, half of the state revenues, but only 19% of GDP. And what will happen in the future? I'll give you two pictures so that you get a clear view of this. Oil and gas production are essentially not growing. So they are now stabilizing. Oil production has come back sharply from a low in the late 1990s, while gas production has been more or less stagnant for the last 2 decades, which is not quite the sense you have, because we think of this, which is the price development. So essentially, the oil and gas boom in Russia has been a price boom since 2003. So you see here it is where in 2003 the oil price took off. And I ended it here at $125. Now the oil price is $113. This will not continue. The oil price will not go up more. And this, I think, is the fundamental fact that determines what President Putin can do. He cannot live on oil rents to the same extent because his way of running the country depends on a rising oil price. And he will have to slow down when he doesn't have his source any longer. So this is the critical issue for Russia's future. Russia is today at the crossroads. Either it goes for state capitalism with 3 to 4% growth, where it is now. Not bad from a European perspective, but from a Russian perspective, or I would also say from a Latvian perspective, this is not quite enough. We want to do better than that. Or you get political and economic liberalization, and you can get 6 to 7% growth. And my view is that the big positive issue is that we have seen these political protests now in Russia since December, because this means that there is a pressure on Putin. There is finally some checks and balances. That's why poor Putin looks so unhappy becoming president again. And we should not feel compassion with him, but with Russian people who are protesting against this. So I think that there will be a reform pressure. And you have a very clear idea out there that Putin is as he is and never changes. I will propose the opposite view to you, that Putin reacts to circumstances, and he is as bad as the circumstances allows him to be. And if we have now seen 3 periods of Putin power. In his first term, from 2000 to 2003, he, from an economic point of view, did pretty well. He consolidated political power, but he undertook substantial economic reforms, continued and completed the Yeltsin reforms, Yeltsin-Gada reforms, from 2002 with a new tax reform, new tax code, and with substantial deregulation of small enterprises, and generally sorting out the state finances. And he did so by balancing oligarchs against siloviki. From an economic point of view, there was very little to complain about in the first term. The second term was essentially state capitalism, hardly any new reforms, and ever more concentration to a limited number of state companies. This was the period of renationalization. The third period was one of asset stripping, where the private companies related to the top leadership were allowed to take as much as they wanted. So this is totally different. My hunch is that Putin is now being forced to go back to his better self that he presented from 2000 to 2003 because of the political pressures, and also because there is not so much of new oil rents that he can pour on his friends and the economy as before. So I think that we are in a much better situation now than previously. So which are the key concerns today? It's very easy to say. If you say, what is Russia's problem today? You can put it in one word, corruption. If you wanted to put in two words, you say corruption and authoritarianism. Another concern is state corporations. I was just in St. Petersburg, and what do you see then? The bank sector is dominated by Sberbank and VTB, two big state banks. Which is the biggest company in town? Gazprom, probably. What do you see? You see the big state shipyards. Outside of St. Petersburg, you have the new foreign-owned car factories, half a dozen. But then you ask, who's the richest person in this town? People don't know. The oligarchs live in Moscow and not in St. Petersburg. So you have a stifling sense of the state corporations dominating. And of course, the big state banks, they have cheaper funding because they are bigger. And on top of that, they have a privilege because they can always be sure that the state will bail them out, as it has done repeatedly. And this is, of course, totally unfair competition. So what is the consequence? The biggest private banks have never got more than 2 to 3% of banking assets, which means that they are not very profitable, and they are not developing, and this means that small and medium-sized enterprises do not get credits very easily. This is not a good environment. And of course, because of the combination of corruption and bureaucracy, you have also poor law enforcement. And this is my favorite picture of Russia's development under Putin. If you see, this is the total length of Russian roads. And it has been constant, more or less, from 97. So Yeltsin could build roads, Putin cannot. Why can't he build roads? Because there's too much corruption. Reportedly, a normal kickback for road construction in Russia is 50%. You can't continue like this. In the same period, the number of cars in Russia has approximately tripled. So I've been to Moscow twice this year and to St. Petersburg once. You can't move because wherever more roads, more cars, and no more roads, no parking, etc. You can't run a country like this. So this is the most striking example of how you can, what the problem is. And now I'll show you an opposite picture, and I'll elaborate a bit on this. We are often talking about Russia as one of the 4 BRICS, Brazil, China, India, the 4 big emerging markets of the future. Russia in recent years has looked worse than the others, because it's growing much more slowly, in particular than China and India. And it doesn't look as dynamic. But what are the numbers? The first number I have here is GDP per capita. Russia is slightly richer than Brazil in those terms, and it's 2.5 times richer than China, still today, which is not commonly perceived, and it's 8 times richer than India. So why do we compare Russia and India? We shouldn't. We are simply totally different categories of development. And you're surely having a strong sense that China is the champion in terms of foreign direct investment. But if you take foreign direct investment stock per capita, Russia has got 7 times more foreign direct investment per capita than China. So in fact, Russia is much more integrated into the world economy than is commonly believed. And think of is that Russia has now car factories from almost all of the big car companies in the world. And they're all foreign. Some are joint ventures, but foreign partners are dominant. And Russia produces something like 1 million cars today. In 5 years or so, it will be 2 million. So they will double production within the next several years, and it will all be foreign cars that are being produced in Russia, just as it should be. And this is showing how international integration is working. And I'll skip a third line, but the fourth line here is tertiary education. Of course, what is really important for the future, that is what you do with your human capital. And particularly pleasant to say that in a university. And in Russia, 3/4 of the youth today, according to the UNESCO statistics, get some tertiary education. While in China it's barely 1/4. So you have the strong middle class ambitions. And even more striking perhaps, it's another number for people who complete college education. In the US today, it's only 36%. It's falling because education is too expensive in the United States. So many can't afford it or don't find it a profitable suggestion. Well, this is, of course, what's important for the country in the future. In Russia, it's 51% of the youth get a complete college education. 36 in the US, 51 in Russia. And these are the numbers that I think are most important for the future. So this is the strength of modernization that I'm seeing in Russia. I would guess that Latvia is about the same level as Russia in this regard, because in this part of the world, we do value higher education, and that is indeed the future. So what does this then leave us with? I would suggest to you that these are growth drivers that we are seeing now in Russia. The big one is the human capital that I've just elaborated upon. And where is this particularly bad, I should say? In Southern Europe. Southern Europe has a growth problem for 2 reasons: that we are not investing enough in human capital, and that we are not sufficiently deregulated. And the other force of growth and modernization in Russia is international integration. Russia will now formally accede to the World Trade Organization in July or so. In December last year, Russia was admitted to the World Trade Organization. And Russia is also about to join the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is quite important for legal standards. So what is happening thanks to this is that Russia has more legal standards coming from abroad, which is one way of checking the corruption in Russia. On top of that, there will be large asset sales from the state companies, higher dividends in the state company, and what Putin is talking most about now is enterprise deregulation. These factors are not so important, but they're at least positive. And I've already discussed the college education, and what will Russia benefit from joining the World Trade Organization? It will, according to calculation, while World Bank economies get 3.3% of GDP in the medium term, that's 5 to 7 years, and in the long term, 11% of GDP. will come a year is wrong there, 11% of GDP higher growth. And this will mainly come from foreign direct investment and more competition in business services. And the hope is that this will switch Russia's growth from energy to human capital, that this will be a game changer for the Russian economy. And investment is not great, but 23% of GDP. It's actually exactly the current Latvian level of investment ratio. It's not great, but it's reasonable. So where does this leave us? It leaves us that, I should come back to this, what President Dmitry Medvedev did during his 4 years as president, I wouldn't say in power, of course, but as president, it was that he did preach a modernization paradigm. He didn't do anything really about it. But this modernization paradigm has won the public debate. And then I come back to this basic view of modernization theory of Samuel Huntington and Seymour Martin Lipset from the late 1950s, that countries that are so rich, pluralist, and educated are not likely to stay authoritarian or, for that matter, corrupt. If you take Huntington's numbers, no country that has had GDP per capita of a level of $8,000 has or more has gone back to authoritarianism after a democratic breakthrough. It doesn't predict when there will be a democratic breakthrough, but if a democratic breakthrough takes place, then it's not likely to reverse into authoritarianism. You can conversely say that in the 1990s, Russia was too poor to have that, not guarantee, but close to it. So what I see here now is piecemeal reforms. Nothing great, but something still positive, with Putin being pressured to do certain things. And the only serious weakness, that is if the oil price goes up, so that Putin can continue and misrule Russia as he had before. So this is what I wanted to suggest to you today. You're welcome to make questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now we have time for questions and comments. Yeah, please, in microphone. Please, colleagues.
Actually, it was very strong argument about the road building and corruption. I had just remarked, if we're using these indicator to Latvia is much more corrupt than Russia. If you take the same. But actually, I have a question about these human capital possibility convert to some growth. You are not talking about the quality of this human capital, because this is these big numbers of the higher education is built up from the private higher education system, where main specialties is psychologists, economists, lawyers, and how you see these big humanitarians will modernize Russia.
Thank you. On the first issue, Latvia does very well according to both the World Bank indicators and Transparency International on corruption in comparison with Russia. If you look upon the post-Soviet countries in relation to the 10 Eastern new EU members, it's a world of difference. There's only one country among the post-Soviet countries that has climbed up to the EU group, and that's Georgia. All the others are far down, and only slightly caricatured, you can say that the post-Soviet countries are really predatory dictatorships, where the aim of a state is to enrich the ruler and his families and the closest friends. And it's very much like the Arab states, the authoritarian and corrupt Arab states. And the EU 10 are really totally different. And I would argue very strongly that the European Union has done a huge amount to reduce corruption in Eastern Europe. I would like to take an example like Romania. Romania is a country that has had no great reformer at all. And it has had a great improvement on the international corruption indicators. I'm thinking in particular of Transparency International, which is easiest to compare over the years and between countries. And it has been the European Union. Having said that, most elections in the 10 Eastern EU members are about corruption. And it's the Bulgarian political scientist Ivan Krastev has said that since corruption is the main theme in almost all East European countries, the incumbent government always loses elections in East European countries, or almost always. And because the incumbent government is always responsible for corruption. Having said that, I agree that Latvia should build more roads. On the second point, I should have said what you just said, but of course quantity and quality are different things. You have a lot of very bad higher education in Russia. But it also takes us to another matter. Russia is now pursuing reforms of higher education. Since a couple of years they have national testing because there was too much corruption at the entrance into higher education. And they are now trying to impose that to have a more objective entrance system. And I should also say that one of the big and quiet changes that has happened in Russia is that male life expectancy has at long last increased by 4 years from 2006 to 2010, that is in 4 years. And the way this was done was quite undramatic. Simply more checks of cardiovascular diseases and a little bit more of cancer screening in primary health care. So it was a very small measure that gave a big result. And of course one can say that it's strange that nothing happened before. And you know now on the Russian cigarette package, it's written, "Kurenie ubivает," smoking kills. No soft EU formulation that smoking can be harmful to your health. It's "Kurenie ubivает," a much more firm and obvious statement. So there are some improvements in this regard, but of course Russia is lagging far behind, both when it comes to the quality of higher education and when it comes to healthcare.
You were put on the last slide that the only weakness there is oil price. How can you argue that?
High oil price means that you have a license to be corrupt. Corruption is Russia's biggest problem. And if we look up on it, Gazprom is my favorite. Gazprom had officially the biggest profits in the world last year, $45 billion. And I've done the calculation. It looks that they are stealing $40 billion from Gazprom a year. And the Gazprom profits are dependent on the oil price. If the oil price goes down, Gazprom's profits go down, and then there's less to steal, which means that Russia will have to be less corrupt. You can argue it like this. So the higher the oil price, the more corruption, and corruption is the biggest problem for Russia's development. And you can also put it in these terms. Either Russia lives on energy or it lives on its human capital. These are really the two big sources of wealth. And of course, in the energy sector, you have 2% of the population employed. It also means that the intelligent people are going into oil and gas, and they are not going into high tech to the same extent. Of course, you make less money in that. In the US, you make money in the Silicon Valley most of all. And second, you make money on Wall Street. So it's important that the high-tech sector, the highest level of manufacturing and services, that they are the most profitable for a society to go right.
Please, more questions. Microphone, please, yeah.
How could you compare Russian Federation and Kazakhstan as an example of cooperation and the role between of those Middle Asian countries, between China and Russia?
Thank you. Good and interesting question. Several different aspects of it. Kazakhstan has developed its top upper middle class extremely well. Kazakhstan is sending students abroad on a big scale. They have a Balshak program sending 3,000 students abroad for studies to the best universities around the world each year. And it's very striking when you enter a Kazakh ministry in Astana. You are met by young people, 30 to 35 years old, who speak perfect English, who have been trained at good British and American universities. And this makes a very good impression. Kazakhstan has basically 7% growth a year, and they are back now after the crisis. Kazakhstan has, you can say, a more consistent authoritarian model than Russia, where the corruption is more based on asset ownership, that the relevant people at the top have got assets, equity in the big companies, rather than living on kickbacks. Kickbacks is really the worst form of corruption. To take over the assets and try to take care of the assets is better. And in Russia now we can see that kickbacks are on reported big deals in medical equipment, 35%. On roads, I mentioned 50%. On pipelines, going up to 70%. And this is what we see reported in the media, and these relations tend to be the same. While in Kazakhstan, you can say that the corrupt people are mainly capitalists. They own the companies and they want them to work. So therefore, this is a reason for Kazakhstan to have higher growth rate under otherwise similar circumstances than Russia. And then over to the relationship to China. China is, of course, enormously important now in Central Asia. And it's a bit surprising that Russia has been so negligent of it. I'm thinking particularly of Gazprom. The striking example here is in April 2009, when Gazprom, because of a big recession, did not want gas from Turkmenistan. Then, rather than making some kind of agreement, they just stopped taking gas. And as a consequence, the gas pipeline exploded on the Turkmen side. And what did the Turkmens do? They speeded up the building of a pipeline to China, that is, the Chinese built and financed the pipeline. And now Russia is only the third or fourth receiver of Turkmen gas. So this is typical how Russia has handled Central Asia. Bully them and not try to get a normal commercial relationship. As a consequence, Russia loses out to China in Central Asia. China is a big investor in Central Asia. China builds roads and pipelines and railways to Central Asia, and Russia doesn't do anything of the kind. So Russia is simply a losing power in Central Asia, while China is moving quietly to the area. And one can also see here that there is some realization about this in Moscow, that about a year ago, the Russian attitude towards the Americans in Afghanistan and Central Asia has changed. That Russia was very intensely trying to get rid of a US base at the airport Manas in Kyrgyzstan previously. Now they are not really interested in getting rid of it. It can be good to have the Americans there, since they are withdrawing from Afghanistan in any case. The Russian attitude towards the Americans in Central Asia has become much more positive, and I think there is also a balancing element with regard to China. Having said that, I'm a bit surprised that President Nazarbayev, who's very cautious and always balances all forces, that he has been prepared to let in the Chinese to this extent in the Kazakh energy sector. He has not allowed Russian companies to come in on a big scale. Local owns some, but rather little, in the Kazakh energy sector. So I wouldn't be surprised if President Nazarbayev would turn against the Chinese, because he has allowed them to come in much more than you would have expected.
Yeah, I have two comments I'd like to make, and if possible to have you then give your opinion about it after that. The first one is about the level of production of oil and gas, which you say has been quite stable and you don't see it increasing it in the future in Russia. I would like to somewhat disagree with that. And
sorry, I didn't. Russia's level I didn't hear.
In oil and gas production.
Yeah.
That there are about 35 new oil fields which are supposed to come into production over the next 5 to 10 years in the Siberian Yamal-Nenets region, plus the Stockman field, which is coming into production over the next years. So I think that we're going to see a rather significant increase of that production. That being said, I think that the oil price is not the weakness of Russia per se. I think one of the problems that Russia is going to face over the next couple of years is that its refining capabilities of all the production that it has, and right now one of the reasons why it's stagnant is because its refining industry is obsolete. It does not have the ability to refine finished products that would allow Russia to compete on international markets such as jet fuels and things like this. It can only refine products on a very limited scale of refining. And I believe that if the investments were made into its refining capabilities, that would allow to compete and to play in markets abroad, which have a legal framework, I mean in the EU and in the States, in the Middle East, which have a legal framework that would probably push down this corruption factor. And I don't think that the price of the crude oil is really the main weakness. It's more the fact that they can't transform this crude oil into more refined goods, and they are stuck at a level where they deal with only crude products, and that obviously raises corruption issues. What is your opinion about that?
First, if we take this, if you refine the oil, that's good for the reasons you suggested, but it doesn't reduce the corruption. There is, for example, in the current issue of The Economist, an article about how the oil trading company Gunvor seems to manipulate the oil price in order to win certain gains. It's very cautiously written because the company Gunvor is known to sue anybody for libel that criticizes it. So in London courts. So it's right that you say more refining is, would be beneficial to Russia, but it would not reduce the corruption. Generally, you have the concept of energy curse, that when you have large incomes coming out of rent, it's very easy to transform that into corrupt revenues, because it's so few people and so little work that is needed to get that money. And you also have this concept, which is very striking among Russians today, ordinary Russians, that they don't see that they own the oil. It's simply out there. And what people think of is the taxes they pay. And since income taxes are very low in Russia, people don't feel that they are financing the corruption of the government, and therefore it's more acceptable. If a government lives on tax revenues that is on the income of the population or in value-added tax on people's consumption, then people are much more opposed to corruption or less tolerant of it. All people are opposed to corruption, majority, and that's also true of Russia. In terms of the oil production, it's true that we are developing new fields, but at the same time, the old fields are declining. So what has happened is that Russia has now essentially revived the old brown fields, mainly in West Siberia. So in the early 90s, there was the idea that these fields are finished and that they will go down. And then with better technique, it turned out that it was possible to boost the production again. So this big rise that we see from 1999 to 2004, it was when the private oil companies, in particular Yukos, brought in the big Western oil service companies, in particular Schlumberger and Halliburton, to work on the old oil fields, because the Russian technology was not good enough. You needed to have better technology. But now it seems that that has leveled out. Partly it is that the tax on oil production is very high. Gazprom has different problems. And these new fields will be developed, but this is why Rosneft now, in the recent weeks, has made big deals with Exxon, Eni, and Statoil to develop these Arctic offshore fields that Rosneft doesn't have the technology for. And the problem has been that there have only been two state companies, Gazprom and Rosneft, that have been entitled to develop the new interesting fields, both offshore and onshore. And they have had the technology to do so. So now it will start, but to get that production going, it will take a long time, something like 10 years. And meanwhile, the old onshore production, primarily in West Siberia, will inevitably fall. Of course, technology develops, so as we are seeing, particularly in the United States, with the shale gas and other non-conventional developments, that the U.S. has increased now oil production in recent years by 2.5 million barrels. That was totally incredible a decade ago. So we are now seeing new oil and gas production from old sources, and of course this should also happen in various degrees in Russia. But the general forecasts are that at best the new sources can balance the decline of the old sources.
Probably last question, yeah. Thank you. Yes, hello. I would like to know, well, we are talking here about oil and gas, but I don't believe that for Russia there are no other ways how to succeed their economy. So what is your probably opinion? What would be the other ways for Russian economy to succeed in the future? Not just oil and gas. Thank you.
Thank you. A good question. The best way of seeing what will succeed in the future is usually to see what is succeeding today. Where is Russia strong? And Russia's obvious strength today in the modern part of the economy, it is internet economy. You might notice that the American internet companies are not doing very well in Russia. You normally have Russian companies that are pursuing the various functions that are being done by American companies abroad. Amazon.com, for example, doesn't operate in Russia. Why? Because Amazon.com is only a sales company. It is not a distribution company. So, and in order to handle internet sales in Russia, you have to have your own distribution company. Therefore you have a couple of Russian companies doing that instead. And Google is in Russia, but Yandex.ru and Mail.ru seem to be stronger. Part of it is the language, but these companies are clearly being able to compete. So the internet area, I think that Russia has all of the competence and it has good companies. So this is something that could develop. If you look up on Russian retail companies, that's of course a domestic industry primarily, but they evolve in competition with foreign companies in Russia in exactly the same way as you see in the United States. So all of a sudden somebody has developed 1,000 department stores around Russia in a very brief period. And this development looks very much like in the US. A third area is the mobile phone companies. The Russian mobile phone companies, Vimpelcom, MTS, and Megafon, they are operating very well. And MTS and Vimpelcom have now become international companies. So I think that these are the kind of companies that we should see developing. But having said that broadly, Julian Cooper of Birmingham University did several years ago a study of comparative advantages of Russian exports. And he found 70 items where Russia had comparative advantages. 66 of them were commodities. So, and only 4 were engineering products. And these were basically the old Soviet products, something like turbines and railway wagons, or things that you would not really think of. So for exports, Russia has such enormous advantages in exports of commodities. But that is also true of Canada and Australia. So that is not necessarily a curse. But what we should see develop is very much domestic, consumer-oriented industries where good Russian companies are fulfilling a need that has not been very well filled for the time being.
According to our schedule, I must close the lecture. Thank you very much, Dr. Olsen.